from the great continue. Okay. You guys didn't record my intros. Is holds a PhD from the great Michigan State University. That's our third speaker. Our fourth speaker is Michael Vann, a professor of history at Cal State Sacramento. Michael is a specialist in the history of French colonial empire and is at work on a bunch of different stuff, but the most recent book I just want to highlight here of the three books that Michael's published is called The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, Empire, Disease, and Modernity in French Colonial Vietnam, which was authored along with Liz Clark. This is uses the techniques of graphic novel, but also interweaves primary sources in a really spectacular, it looks amazing. I've got to get a hold of this book. Michael has also published work on Hanoi and its urban context, and has held multiple Fulbright fellowships. I have to mention, it indicates on his Wikipedia page that he is an accomplished surfer and black belt. So look out. So Michael is our fourth speaker on our panel today and holds a PhD from UC Santa Cruz. I'm Zephyr Frank. I teach history at Stanford, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to very quickly now remind everyone of what the three prompts are that we've asked our panel to talk about today. The first one is, how does inequality as a phenomenon, experience, or idea feature in your work? So it's just kind of getting down to the basics. The second prompt builds out from there, and we ask, how do you connect issues of inequality to urban and global historical dynamics, particular to historical intersections of the urban and the global? So looking outside of the city to the global framework. That's the second question we've asked our panelists to consider. And our third prompt was, what other scholarship outside of your geographic and chronological field influenced your thinking about global urban inequality? What kinds of conversations across fields of historical inquiry would be fruitful to pursue when investigating the subject? So this is, we're trying to build from the basic, what is the initial motivation of the work, to these larger, ever larger circles of interest. And so those are the prompts. And let's get started with, how does inequality as a phenomenon, experience, or idea feature in your work? And the first panelist that I'm going to call on here is Constanza. Can you kick us off here with about 4 minutes or so responding to that first question?
Thank you, Zephyr, for your introduction, and thank you for the invitation to this roundtable and to its amazing organizers. First, let me give you a short description of my current work. I'm studying the conflicting process of the disentitlement of corporate and common property in Bogotá to explore how urban inhabitants understood, disputed, and shaped the mid-19th century liberal institutional revolution, or reform or revolution as some have considered it. The disentitlement decree ordered the expropriation and immediate sale at public auction of all rural and urban real estate in the national territory belonging to the church and the municipality. And fueled by ideological and fiscal pressures, the magnitude of this process was enormous. Most of Bogotá's population live and work in the expropriated lands under possessory and usufruct agreements established with the church and the municipality during 3 centuries of colonial domination. In the years that followed disentitlement, thousands of tenants and workers were expelled from expropriated houses and lands, or had to renegotiate with new owners, trying to avoid losing usufructual rights previously protected by colonial law and custom. So during the 19th century, liberal governments in Colombia, Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Andes decreed the absolute privatization of common and corporate lands, arguing that private property was the basis of freedom, progress, and democracy. This conflicting process has been considered in Latin America a quintessential problem of agrarian history. However, my work shows how this reform was also disputed in urban centers and urban peripheries, deeply transforming social relations around property. So what does inequality feature in my work? For the government, disentailment means not only the end of common and corporate property, but the legal abolition of the system of real estate possession and conveyance around which the church, the municipality, and their usufructuaries had established economic and social relations for centuries. Every considered incomplete form of possession had to be eradicated in favor of full property rights. However, in practice, all regimes' form of possession and conveyance did not entirely disappear, and many people continued to transfer and possess properties as they had done for centuries. They were, however, now, by the effect of a legal change, on the other side of the line regarding the law. I am interested then in showing how modern and incomplete was the transition from colonial legal pluralism to 19th century liberal legal monism, and from old regime forms of possession and conveyance to private property, and how urban inequality was produced and reproduced in a particular context during this institutional transition. And just one more thing, I'm also interested in understanding the relationship between property privatization and citizenship during this period. During and immediately after independence, and in spite of the discourse of Republican equality, citizenship in Colombia, as in the rest of Latin America, and in fact in most of the Western world, was limited or conditioned to a great extent by property ownership. The analysis of this relationship, inseparable in the 19th century, allows or perhaps forces us to link the history of capitalism and of economic institutions with the history of popular political culture and the inexorable relationship that emerged in the 19th century between property and citizenship, or more to the point, between economic and political inequality. So I will leave there.
Fantastic. Extra bonus points for being right on time. So next up on my list of panelists to talk about this first question about how does inequality figure in your work is David. So David, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Oh, I see. The Zoom is, pops up
No
here,
worries.
pops up there. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and to the organizers for inviting me to participate in the panel and in this remarkable series of global urban history events. It's an honor to be taking part with these incredible panelists. Thanks also to Zephyr for being probably the only other person beyond my mother to watch that interview with me on the web. While thinking about how to answer this first question, I came across a helpful remark from my colleague, Sam Wetherill, in his brilliant recent history of Britain's 20th century urban built environment foundations. Wetherill writes that urban forms he examines, quote, show how space was the outcome of history rather than merely the terrain on which it unfolded. My approach to inequality has been guided by something of a reverse logic, taking a subject that both scholars and policymakers overwhelmingly treat in economistic or sociological terms as an outcome of history, and investigating it instead as a historical terrain of intimate human interaction. Inequality has been less interesting to me as the observable or quantifiable result of specific histories than as the shifting social ground on which those histories disclose their various intertwined mechanisms of production and reproduction. This approach to inequality emerged not so much from a conscious theoretical choice as from a historiographical and writerly one. When I began my doctoral research, which was the basis for my book, Progressive Inequality, I decided to examine moments of cross-class interaction in urban space, excuse me. Such moments, I believed, had been understudied in US-focused work, in preference to many valuable inquiries into particular US class formations in relative isolation, and institutional investigations of inequalities production as an economic phenomenon that tended to neglect class as a useful heuristic. I also self-servingly thought that narratives of class collision would make for more dramatic and exciting stories to tell. At the time, I'm not entirely sure that my theoretical framework was much more sophisticated than I'd like to try to make sense of the things that happened when rich and working poor New Yorkers actually encountered each other during the Progressive era. As those stories of urban inequality unfolded, however, stories about fire insurance fraud, tenement house reform, begging letter writers, settlement house fundraising pageants, and cross-class labor uprisings, they revealed underlying structuring histories of inequality that reached past questions of class exclusively and well past their city and moment. Histories of empire, xenophobia, and racism as influences not only on approaches to social reform, but also on built urban space in the US and beyond through their physical articulation in neoclassical architectural trends celebrating a mythology of the Roman Empire. Histories of charity and poor law, codified in the Middle Ages to manage a social landscape assumed to be the will of God, only to be repurposed in the modern era as a tool of social transformation and behavioral control. Histories of the irreconcilable tension between bourgeois feminist humanism's emancipatory egalitarian ambitions and the invidious social relations of capitalism that more often than not funded its activities, and histories of the pervasive violence to body and spirit in daily urban industrial working life that could either incite or crush working class rebellions. Intimate stories of inequality in New York between 1890 and 1920 became windows onto these deeper and broader histories, whose geographical and temporal parameters stretched far beyond the more immediate arena of interest. Even if mundane professional incentives inclined me to set these stories of inequality in a US history frame, the pasts that structured them always stretched far beyond New York or the United States. For most people outside the US, I think this is self-explanatory. As Professor Lana Barber noted in the UHA's opening plenary on the state of American cities 2 weeks ago, urban inequality of all forms in the US necessarily bears the imprint of transatlantic slavery and forced migration in the communities of Black Americans and migrants from Africa, South and Central America, East and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, descendants of the Middle Passage and refugees from US empire's unceasing economic and political depredations that make up disproportionate shares of the US urban working poor. In this sense, US urban inequality is always already global. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Next up, I have on my list Hillary. Please go ahead with the first prompt, inequality in relation to your work.
Okay, thank you. And let me just add my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So I'm going to just talk briefly about my earlier scholarship instead of the second project. And that's mostly because I think these questions came out of my first research and they'll carry over, but they really, the questions of inequality really came together for me in my early scholarship. So my early work took up the question of how and why a relatively small but influential Afro-European bourgeoisie, in French, they would be called today métis, or at the time, probably mulâtre, or we would say mulatto in English, that this kind of group that gained wealth and power in early colonial French West Africa, my research focused on this group, but mainly on the political and social history of Senegal's 19th century colonial capital, which was called Saint Louis by the French, and Dar by the Wolof, and that this place essentially emerges as a small commercial outpost in the 18th century, and then grew into a multicultural town in the 19th century because of its expansion, because of the expansion of Atlantic commerce and then French imperialism, colonial conquest. And so just to give you an idea here, the city of Dakar eventually surpassed Saint Louis as the major urban center of Senegal after 1905, when it became the capital of French West Africa, and then after 1960 as the capital of the independent Republic of Senegal. So in 1960, Dakar's population was about 350,000 people. Today, it's 1.3 million people. And if you count the whole Dakar metro area, population statistics say that it's about 3.2 million people. So it's, enormous change in a short period of time. And so what I did with my research is to kind of try to go back and tease out the different sort of layers of social history that impacted the political world and also the cultural world of these coastal towns. And the ways in which they contribute to the makings of a larger Senegalese republic. In my research, I grappled with how to understand a group that was once wealthy but lost wealth. People who once had the ear of French officials due to their monopoly on local politics, but who lost power after young African leaders ascended to politics after World War I. And so, in sort of doing this, I focused on family histories, people like the Devez, who on the surface of things appear to be the elite of the elite. But then when we dig deeper, what my research, I think, shows is that at one point, the Devez family, for example, rivaled some of the wealthiest families in Bordeaux, for example. But at another point in time, they lost all of that wealth, right? The successive generations died as destitute women in the 1950s and 1960s. So this sort of issue of kind of intergenerational wealth and what gets transferred and what gets lost manifests itself in these families who at one time profited from being in close proximity to colonial power, and at other times being replaced in the sort of circuit of capitalism. And many people have written about this, not just for the Métis of Senegal, but also for Black Muslim traders of Senegal's colonial towns, Mohammed Mbodj, Mamadou Diouf, Boubacar Bari. These are just a few of the names of people who have written about the ways in which the commercial enterprises replaced African intermediaries with Lebanese and Syrian entrepreneurs as the individuals who would go and live en brousse, as they would say, and become the middlemen for French companies in the early part of the 20th century. So in any case, I want to just wrap this up by saying that I think by looking at this one particular town, those kinds of social and economic relations and the processes by which they changed over time become much more visible to us than in discourses about who is elite and who is not elite.
Oh, thank you so much. That's fantastic. It's wonderful to be reminded of how sometimes these structures can be more ephemeral than we often assume. Okay, so we have one more speaker to go here on the first prompt, inequality in featuring in your work, and that is Michael. I think we still have you going strong here.
Can you hear me okay? Is it okay? So first off, apologies to all. There was an unavoidable family conflict, and I'm in rural El Salvador with a poor internet connection. This is why we should stay in cities. Stay in cities and stay in cities. They've got good internet. And thank you so much to the organizers. It's really great to be a part of this panel, and definitely a dream conversation. Because my internet connection's pretty weak, I'm actually going to keep my comments unusually short for me. As my work is on the history of colonial cities in Southeast Asia, inequality is at the very center of my research. My initial dissertation project was to explore the construction of colonial whiteness in French Hanoi. What I found is that white supremacy was literally built into the urban infrastructure. I mean, literally built into the shape of the city. Be it radical disparities in housing conditions, population density, the width of streets and roads, availability to public spaces, from sidewalks to private gardens to public parks, or the electrical grid. Racial inequality was the single most important factor in colonial urban experience, in the experience of life in the city. And again, these racialized inequalities were part of the city planning. And in the era of high imperialism, the city planners are quite open about that in the historical records, in the archive. So in short, the point of the colonial city was racial inequality. Of course, in the era of high imperialism, the colonial order of things created a nexus of race and class. Racial otherness thus reinforced class differences for the vast majority of the population. Yet, of course, there were always outliers. Wealthy and powerful Asian merchants, and poor whites, such as Hanoi's Italian construction workers and Corsican railwaymen, complicated racial and class distinctions. Both groups were profoundly unwelcome in the minds of the French colonial municipal authorities. Destitute Southern Europeans could be repatriated once their services were no longer needed, but wealthy Asians had to be accommodated, and the French begrudgingly gave them municipal council representation, but always in the minority of the city council seats, even though they stood for 95% of the population. For my book project, I decided that the best example of colonial Hanoi's urban inequalities was not to be found above ground, but below ground in Hanoi's sewer system. With a state-of-the-art sewer network servicing the French Quarter, the colonial state built only rudimentary drainage gutters in the so-called native quarter. French homes and businesses had running water and flush toilets, while the local population had to collect water from public fountains and dumped night soil in the streets. Such radical urban inequality made a mockery of the soi-disant civilizing mission, so central to the French justification of imperialism. For Hanoi's Vietnamese and Chinese residents, French colonial urbanism was not solving the public health crises that it claimed to be fixing. In the words of Mark Driscoll in his book, Absolute Erotic, Absolute Grotesque, The Living, the Dead and the Undead in Japanese Imperialism, empire was not, quote, delivering the goods. Of course, with the case study of my plague-carrying sewer rats, we see that the colonial health measures could also backfire and even create new health crises, such as the third bubonic plague pandemic. So again, this inequality, racial inequality, is right at the center, and I explore the way they map with racial and political powers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I'd just say, before we transition to the next prompt, I think this has been a wonderful start to our conversation, and we've been reminded here of a variety of key issues that I think will continue to resonate in our conversation today and going forward. So we've been hearing here about institutions and the way that urban institutions pattern inequality. We've been hearing about the city in a way as a space or an engine that can produce inequality, that can be very intentional, as Michael has just indicated. But it's also this arena where these clashes or experiences of inequality get enacted or experienced. And then I think, as Hillary, pointed out very elegantly, there is this long kind of life cycle aspect of inequality that can extend across generations, which can kind of shift the way that we think about or what it means to be in the elite or out of the elite, and so forth. So this is a great place to start. I think we're off to the races here. So for the next prompt, we're going to be thinking about global historical dynamics. So this has already begun to come up in some of your comments, but I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone on the panel has to say about how you connect issues of inequality to these global dynamics. And so I'm going to mix up the order here so that different people can get the first word in. So Michael, since you just went, I'm going to ask you to go again. Tell us about the global. And I guess, that seems to connect very well with what you were just saying about the colonial order, et cetera. So if you don't mind, Michael, please carry us on.
I don't get a break after being the last one to go. I don't get to rest. Okay, I'll jump right into it. So obviously work on colonial cities requires a global perspective. After all, colonialism is the history of white guys getting into boats, traveling the world, and trying to reorder just about everywhere they went. So colonial and imperial history, by definition, is this intersection of the global and the local. And to be very frank, when I initially was doing my study of Hanoi, I did not have a proper global perspective. It's only thanks to my training to teach as a world historian that I began to really understand that, well, to be a little cheeky, no city is an island, right? Not even Venice or Mumbai, that there's always these global connections. And in the colonial connection, it's even more pronounced, as power centers can be far removed from the city in question, as can the economic connections that are set up. But recently, my work has been focusing more on the history of public health, which was particularly good timing to have a book on pandemics come out in 2018. So putting the history of urban public health infrastructure at the center requires taking a global perspective, especially in the era of the third bubonic plague pandemic and in the waves of 19th and 20th century cholera pandemics. These diseases can only be understood as part of global processes. Here comes a long sentence. With the 1815 eruption of Sumbawa's Mount Tambora, triggering temperature fluctuations in the Bay of Bengal, which caused cholera to mutate into a more virulent and dangerous form, just as British colonial intervention pushed Bengali peasants into coastal lands, marginal coastal lands that had previously been uninhabited, where they were exposed to the cholera, the mutated cholera, and then the new imperial maritime shipping system took this new mutated cholera around the world, where it eventually infected French Foreign Legion troops in Algeria, who were then deployed in the 1880s to invade Hanoi, thus bringing the cholera pandemic to Vietnam. Keeping that in mind, we can't think of Hanoi's history as anything other than embedded in these global connections. The same goes for the brown rats who carried fleas bearing the bubonic plague. They jumped on French-built railways in southern China or steamships leaving ports in southern China, and then arrived in Hanoi, jumping off and doing what rats do and bringing the plague to the city. Thus, plague outbreaks and pandemic disease are the perfect example of the necessity of having a global perspective on urban history and tying these two together. The history of disease and public health, I argue, should really be central to the study of urban history. I think the past 2 years have made a good argument for that. And they can only be understood as the intersection of the global and the local. Pandemics are not naturally occurring phenomenons. They are created by human beings, and they require long distance connections, but also dense population centers, urban centers. So that's sort of my thoughts on that prompt.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. That was a long sentence too, but a good one. A lot to chew on there. Next, if you don't mind, Hillary, I'd like to ask for your thoughts on the global dimension.
Sure, I'm glad to. And in thinking about this question, I really thought about the importance of understanding African towns, ports, and cities, not as static, passive receptacles of world historical events, but rather as key locations for exchange of ideas and goods, as important sites of engagement and interaction between peoples across the oceans and across the African hinterlands. Also as transformative sites, right? Places in which these were laboratories for the development of modern capitalism, of modernities and so forth. And so here I want to just echo what Michael just said in terms of thinking about global perspective and sort of, you know, even in my first work, I dealt with much of this, but the sort of ways in which I see these interconnections is happening as I'm looking across the ocean at the Caribbean and the relationship between the Caribbean and Africa in the period of the Atlantic slave trade, right? Rather than seeing these African ports as places where enslaved peoples left from and never returned to, looking at this from a different perspective allows us to see the interconnected ties. So, and I want to just also say here that I tend to focus a lot on the Atlantic, but there's some really exciting work that's been done on these same exact questions, but on the Indian Ocean side. And when it comes to African history, we have had a tendency, for good reason, to look inward and to see the local as the most important. But you know, some of this research, people like Pierre Larson, Jeremy Prestold on commodities in the Indian Ocean world, Elizabeth McMahon on slavery in the Indian Ocean world, Sue Peabody's new book, and others, Iqbal Akhtar in religious studies, have all sort of looked at the ways in which cities on the Indian Ocean coast of Africa were part and parcel of all of the developments happening in the Indian Ocean world. And then I also think that I'm making this small caveat that while I'm thinking about these cities, I'm also quite aware that what happens on the ports and on the coast is also a conversation between peoples of the hinterland and the coast, that we can't separate Africa's interior cities and cities that existed before the transatlantic slave trade, irrespective of the trans-Saharan trade, within this mix. But I want to say a few words about how the urban and global intersect in specific ways around the rise and development of the transatlantic slave trade. So here, inequality manifests itself in particular kinds of ways. in study of Atlantic Africa. One of the books that has really inspired me is called The World in a Very Small Place in Africa, A History of Globalization in Numi, the Gambia, which was written by Donald Wright. And one of the reasons why this is a book that's been around a while, but it's so important to us, I think, is because he shows us that places that there were places in West Africa, especially Numi, this little place that at the time was a strategic location for transatlantic trade because it was at the mouth of the Gambia River. In the 15th century, it was at the intersection of trans-Saharan and transatlantic trade. And that all directions sort of pointed from the oceans towards Numi. But when we look back at Numi today, we don't even know where Numi is on the map, right? That we don't think of this as part of the global urban landscape. And this is in part because of the changing direction of British imperialism in the 19th century, the colonial economy of the 20th century that relegated the people of Numi to being producers for a world economy that sought more and more raw materials, cash crops to fuel industrialization in the metropole. And so I really think that some new research on Africa's Atlantic ports and towns is really expanding our thinking from the sort of development, underdevelopment paradigm to better understanding the interior dynamics of these spaces. So for example, Rebecca Shumway's work on the Fante of the Gold Coast and Maria Canjijo on Benguela and her study of the Portuguese in West Central Africa show us how the violence of the transatlantic slave trade impacted Africa's Atlantic cities and hinterlands, but also pays attention to the survival strategies of town residents. Others have problematized this around gender and how gender shaped inequalities in Africa's Atlantic town. I'm thinking here of Pernille Ibsen's research on the intermarriage between Ga women and Danish traders on the Gold Coast, Vanessa Oliveira on Afro-Portuguese marriage and slavery in Luanda, for example, that illustrate the important role of women, but also how patriarchy contribute to the inequality of these households. And then the last thing I want to just say here is that we also have to think of the afterlives of the Atlantic slave trade for the contemporary city. Something that I think David also sort of alluded to, that it's important to note that scholars of transnational and global histories and histories of the city in Africa are also thinking deeply about the afterlives of the Atlantic slave trade for the contemporary city and the inequalities that have stemmed from this. Alan Howard was one of the first people I read who was doing this, making these sorts of connections for Freetown, Sierra Leone and liberated Africans and what becomes the sort of political dynamics of urban centers on West Africa's coast. Christine Mann's study of the history of Lagos, for example, shows us how Atlantic slavery redefined how elites controlled local populations and then set the stage for this kind of dynamic in the megacity on the continent today. And then lastly, Addo Quayson's Oxford Street, Accra, argues that the socio-economic inequalities that we see in Accra today are the result of layers of historical and urban processes that date to Afro-Brazilian migration to the towns in the 19th century. And, and here he asks us to think not just about the history of movement and migration, but things like urban planning, things like public transportation that exist in the towns today, but that carry all of this symbolism that goes back to earlier times and then is layered on with new and present understandings of exchanges of commodities, exchanges of peoples in various spaces, and those sorts of things. So I say that to say that I think this scholarship is much more in tune with continuities of inequality in African cities that are locally constructed, but also shaped by global historical processes.
Thank you, Hillary. That was fantastic. So much food for thought here, and I'm generating lots of questions myself already here for what I hope will be our time for Q&A. But sticking with our plan, we're going to continue with our roundtable here. The question here is inequality and global historical dynamics. And the next person on my list is David.
Excellent, excellent. So I'd like to begin this question by emphasizing both Michael and Hillary's excellent points with a rhetorical question. Is it ever possible in an era dominated by the social relations of imperial and global capitalism to tell stories of urban inequality as purely local or national? Telling most stories of urban inequality over the past few centuries, it seems to me, should usually demand making connections to global or globalizing historical dynamics. Again, I make no claim to any special method in making such connections. My approach is simply to view inequality as a terrain of historical action and let the story take me where it will. So the simplest way for me to illustrate this is with a gloss on my current work, looking at the life of, as Zephyr said, Alfred Winslow Jones, an erstwhile Soviet sympathizer, socialist, and New Deal intellectual. Jones's socialist-inspired desire to reduce inequality in, as he put it, income, status, and prestige led him in 1949 to create the first hedge fund. So the pungent historical irony of the hedge fund emerging in part from a desire to reduce inequality begins to make more sense when one attends to the various inequalities that structured Jones's life up to that point, conditioned his theorization of the hedge fund, and connected in obvious ways to global historical dynamics of empire, white supremacy, international corporate and financial expansion, and anti-communism, among others. I find these global dynamics lurking in successive stories of urban inequality that shaped his life. As a function of his father's managerial position at General Electric, Jones was born in Melbourne, Australia, but grew up in Schenectady in upstate New York. On opposite sides of the globe, these cities were both colonial settlements being reshaped by connected ongoing processes of global electrification, imperial transition, mass migration, urban industrial conflict, and financial churn. Jones began to gravitate to the left as an adolescent, confronted by the juxtapositions of his early life in those cities' idyllic suburban developments, awash as they were in progressive political rhetoric, yet also racked by prolonged strikes, industrial poverty, stark racial and gender divisions of labor, and in 1911 Schenectady, a socialist takeover of municipal government. After intimate participation in the racialized labor regime of a merchant ship in his early 20s, which also exposed him to semi-colonial poverty around a port city of the Yangtze River, he forged a more rigorous internationalist anti-capitalism between Depression-era New York and Berlin. His confrontation, and to an attenuated but real degree, experience with economic misfortune and desperation in these two cities convinced him, along with millions of others, that capitalism was ending. Faced with city and world-altering nightmares of fascism alongside dreams of working-class liberation, Jones threw in his lot with the latter. In the late 1930s, he moved temporarily to Akron, Ohio, carrying out doctoral fieldwork for a sociological study of class relations. He conducted comprehensive interviews with militant rubber factory workers, corporate managers, small business people, and farmers from the city's outskirts to determine the relative value people placed on personal rights and property rights, respectively. Only a democratic politics that provided economic stability, he concluded, could stave off the cascading global upheavals of the previous decades. Jones had come to see all the urban inequality he had experienced and witnessed as connected, an outgrowth of urban and global historical dynamics conditioned by war and political instability that successive crises of capitalism had produced. Gradually losing faith in New Deal intellectual activist engagements, journalism, and politics over the 1940s, however, and in part due to an act of implicit anti-communist blacklisting that kept him from a job at the UN, he turned to finance. He theorized that a counter-cyclical investment model of selling bubbles short and buying into crashes could help ease economic fluctuations that had seeded so much poverty and political turmoil in nearly every city he'd inhabited over nearly half a century. The intimate inequalities of his global life conditioned his manner of response. Unfortunately, that response's embrace of capitalist machinery to manage the crisis-prone social relations of capitalism not only prefigured the failure of many similar subsequent efforts in our age of global neoliberalism and so-called market solutions, but also provided such efforts with an institutional accelerator. The story of the hedge fund in this sense provides another instance in which the global urban inequalities of the early 20th century are still fueling those of the 21st. Thanks.
Wonderful. I'm glad that we got to the story of Mr. Jones. Excellent. So last on my list, but certainly not least, for an answer to this question about global dynamics, I'm going to turn now to Constanza.
Thank you, Zephyr. I agree with most of the things here Michael, Hillary, and David have already pointed out about the global character of colonial history, for example. So I wrote an article recently published on the enclosure of the Ejidos of the city of Bogotá, which was a process of land privatization in the 18th century under colonial rule. I discuss in this article the relationship between European imperial wars in the second half of the 18th century and the end of common lands in Colonial New Granada, that later became Colombia. Here I analyze the fiscal nature of municipal ejidos to show how imperial dynamics transform land use on both sides of the Atlantic and to explore the specificities of common land enclosures in some of the Spanish colonies. Local inequalities derived from process of enclosure in colonial context cannot be understood, as you have already pointed out, as separate from the imperial dynamics. But I want to give you some examples being a 19th century historian. One of the main criticisms that 19th century Latin American historians can make to the social and economic history of the 70s or 80s, for example, is that under the influence of dependency or modernization theories, the 19th century was studied by and large to analyze what were then considered the roots of underdevelopment. A number of neo-institutionalist or path dependency theories, writers, supporters have continued to ask similar questions today, but look into the answers from within. This was a way, or one might say, of instrumentalizing the past. Going to the 19th century to answer these 20th century questions ended up shaping a 19th century through the lens of underdevelopment, backwardness, marginality, or exploitation, even if these terms are not used explicitly. I think that global urban history, when it's very rooted in a specific basis, can help decentralizing historical narratives today, or modernity, capitalism, and even urbanization and inequality, questioning them as categories of analysis, and of course can help to overcome assumptions of fixed centers and peripheries, or between active and passive historical actors. Sorry. On the other hand, I think that the intersection of the urban and the global can help to refine our awareness about synchronicity. In my work, I can see in particular not only how the urban poor, particularly local, participated locally in global economic processes, but how notions of property rights were nurtured by external influences, as well as by local institutional arrangements and by concrete exchanges and disputes over land, and how in this complex process of property negotiation, they reformulated notions of democracy, equality, and citizenship, from which they were largely excluded, that circulated in the 19th century Europe and the Americas. I think global urban history, and particularly 19th century global urban history, can on the one hand show how Latin American societies or some of their actors saw themselves in relation to the world and how they acted accordingly. And on the other hand, how Latin America was in some aspects in the center of some global processes and exchanges, not in the periphery, as you have already mentioned. Some historians have shown, for example, how the 19th century Latin America was central in the how in the 19th century Latin America was central in the Republican experiment, and in fact becoming a political vanguard in the Atlantic world, with republics in place and even universal male suffrage, mostly occurring in cities when other Western societies reinstituted monarchies and maintained slavery. I also think that the historical intersections of the urban and the global allow us to ask, of course, different questions. For global urban historians, it would be very difficult to ask about the formation of an incomplete or peripheral form of capitalism, for example, because thinking of the urban and the global together, we could not depart from the idea a priori that Latin American capitalism is necessarily incomplete or peripheral. Of course, some of these arguments can be debatable, but what I want to say is that putting in the case, I know, Latin America at the center of global questions to understand the functioning of global processes has allowed recent historiography not to put aside questions of inequality, domination, and exclusion, but to look at these inequalities not in terms of the conventional geographical areas or chronologies, or to question Latin America's exclusive path of defeat, which is not necessarily the case across the board. Global urban history makes it possible, I think, to portray cities as creations, but also as creators of large-scale phenomena, or to analyze not only the specifically local form acquired by global economic and political processes, but how global processes are largely the product of locally specific arrangements and practices. That would be.
Thank you, Constanza. Okay, so that's our second prompt. How does the urban relate to the global in terms of inequality? And we're all doing great. Everyone's doing a good job here, staying close to being on time. However, we are at 12:51, and in order to try to ensure that we have some robust conversation and questions, I'm going to plead with the panelists, if you can, try to be as brief as possible while still making the points that you want to make about this third prompt on our list of subjects, which is, what other scholarship outside of your geographic or chronological fields influences your thinking about urban inequality? What kinds of conversations do you think would be fruitful to pursue along these lines? So I'm going to call on, if you don't mind, Hillary, are you ready to go?
Sure, and I'll be very brief. Yes. What scholarship outside of my area has most impacted my thinking, especially on class, race, gender, and inequality in urban settings. I have to say that for me, it's really been research on the 20th century histories of the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural US South to the industrial North, also histories of whiteness, which I remember reading very early on and sort of gravitating to people like David Roediger and his work, because I recognized it. It spoke to me, and that probably has something to do with being the daughter of people who migrated in the Great Migration and settled in Detroit. And that sort of research on urban industrialism in Detroit really spoke to me. In terms of conversations across fields of historical inquiry that are important, I just want to highlight two things, and I'm glad to talk more about this in question and answer. One of them, I think, and I've just been thinking a lot about this recently, is literature on environmental history, climate change, and its impact on the global cities from the past, moving into present times. One of the reasons that this is really speaking to me is because many of these sites, especially on West Africa's Atlantic coast, historic sites of the Atlantic slave trade, will be underwater as sea levels rise. And some of these exact locations are places where we see some of the biggest cities on the continent. Dakar, as I mentioned, Accra in Ghana, Lagos in Nigeria. These are places that are already confronting these challenges. And I think this study and the literature on these questions helps us to think through what some of the kinds of local responses were to big historical shifts, such as the slave trade that impacted the environments and ecologies of local urban environments. But it also helps us to think, through those local solutions, and also the sorts of ways in which inequalities are exacerbated by environmental change. And then secondly, I think more conversations with African diaspora studies literature is also useful. And I'm thinking about this in part because there's so much wonderful research right now on the history of, especially of Black populations in Europe and European capitals like Paris, Rome, Berlin, Lisbon, London, places where there are kinds of these engaged conversations by intellectuals in a kind of Pan-African history that have taken place across the 20th century and then carry on into the 21st century, where there are all kinds of new sociological formations in these European capitals that involve many of these same questions. So that's how I that's what I'm thinking about in terms of your question.
Thank you so much. Excellent. That's great to get us kicked off here. Next up, I'm going to ask, I have here on my list, David, would you like to say something briefly about scholarship outside of geographic or chronological fields?
Yeah, I'll do my best and maybe edit a little bit in the interest of time. So as a historian trying to tell a social biographical history across 5 continents in a century, I think it would probably be hopeless for me to attempt a catalog of all the scholarship I've been consulting in thinking about global urban inequality. But just to name a few, Hazel Carby and Emma Rothschild's histories of empire and colonialism, tracing inequalities' roots over huge stretches of geography and time through intimate biographical or autobiographical narratives, have been revelatory to me. Critical theoretical work by Nancy Fraser and Raleigh Yagi on capitalism, as well as legal and historical scholarship by Katerina Pistor, I think provide lucid abstract frameworks for thinking about concrete stories of global urban inequality. Eco-Marxist literature, to echo the environmentalist theme, on the capitalist scene and commodity frontiers from Jason Moore and Raj Patel has sort of belatedly helped me begin integrating an environmental lens into my work. Finally, putting histories of real estate alongside work on contemporary political economy by Benjamin Braun and Destin Jenkins has helped me trace connections between transformations of urban social landscapes, the daily life of inequality, and global forces of finance and white supremacy. So that's just a smattering. But what I really wanted to say was that real estate and housing inequality is on my mind these days here in Berlin. I'm in Berlin at the moment, which leads me to the second part of the prompt about conversations, not just across fields, but sort of topic-wise in the direction our work is taking. So global investor classes, I'm sure everybody knows, and its asset managers have been snapping up urban real estate, driving rents to unaffordable heights against stagnant wages in cities all over the world. As historians such as Paige Glotzer and Alexia Yates have shown, the phenomenon of foreign real estate investment and its exacerbations of various inequalities is hardly new. Indeed, the Melbourne of Alfred Jones's birth in 1900, still recovering from a speculative fever fueled by British imperial investment from London, is a good example of this dynamic. Yet, I think by weaving inequality ever deeper into the life of global cities through investment flows that produce continually shifting intersections of inequality across regional and national boundaries, capitalists also expand the terrain on which the contradictions of capitalist social relations become visible. So this has elicited movements of working people, then and since, communitarian, socialist, anarchist, communist, and more, that have offered alternative visions of social relations and intermittently succeeded in demanding democratic checks on capitalist power. I'm sure many of these movements feature in the work of all of my fellow panelists. Just over a month ago, in a demonstration of such collective will, 56% of the voting public here in Berlin staged a small act of rebellion against that power. So they voted yes to a referendum advising the dispossession of a major corporate landlord aiming to relieve struggling renters by socializing over 200,000 private housing units in the city. Basically, what I want to say, just to kind of sum this up in a shorter version, is that a lot of people have been reacting to this dismissively as advisory, it'll never be enacted. But this kind of misses the power of global urban dynamics as providing a platform for an amplified platform for expressions of democratic possibility. I think we've been seeing a lot of this lately. The Occupy movement leaps to mind, but so too the WTO battle in Seattle of 1999 and Porto Alegre's World Social Forum in 2001, the crystallization of the movement for Black Lives following the killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, and George Floyd in Minneapolis, along with countless others, the explosion of climate strike events globally since 2018, and the Hong Kong democracy protests of the past 2 years. All these present instances in which terrains of globally visible inequality, material, racial, environmental, political, and more, become platforms for demands that the social relations reproducing such inequality be entirely reimagined. So for historians investigating global urban inequality, I think conversations about the longer histories of democratic collective movements can and must provide us with vital insight. Research into such movements provides a reminder more urgently necessary than ever that capitalist social relations and the inequalities they produce in global cities, however powerful and pervasive they may have become, have never been ubiquitous or self-reproducing. We need not submit to a future, as economist Branko Milanovic has prophesied, of capitalism alone, but we require historical perspective to avoid blind alleys and false starts. Thanks.
Thank you, David. That was bracing and really, really great. So we have two more panelists to go here before we can open up for Q&A. And so I'm going to call now on Constanza. Are you good to go? If you can be brief if you can, and we'll, but we are eager to hear your
I'm
thoughts.
going to try to be as fast as David. So my work is largely based on geography, particularly Marxist geography. And I think that I don't have to explain why, but I would say some things because it has built a solid theoretical body, it seems to me, to explain the unequal and contradictory ways in which capitalism expands spatially. But also it has been important for my work because it analyzes the relationship between the expansion of capitalism and the necessary and constant elimination of the obstacles that impede its advance, be they spatial or institutional, through urban or legal reforms, for example. And also because it has given theoretical depth to the concept of scale, demonstrating the necessary interrelationship between the local, the state, or the global, for example, in order to understand, among other things, the ways in which the same clearly localized actor necessarily moves, albeit in different ways, in all these scales, negotiating and disputing them. My work is also influenced by the recent history of capitalism, which is a history I like because it regards what we call capitalism as an incomplete and disparate process. And also because it understands it as both as a global process that takes shape, at least legally, within the institutional boundaries of the nation state, and also as a process defined and shaped locally through everyday and locally specific economic and social relations. I would like also to emphasize how important I believe is the economic history, I think, in the work of global urban history. And also to recover economic history for history, and in particular for political history. After the economic crisis experienced in Europe, in the United States, and Latin America in recent years, there is an increasing debate about the crisis of capitalism and the need to rethink it and understand how it works. In this economic and political context, historians in many parts of the world are trying to return to the history of capitalism, but with new eyes, with new tools, and with questions about the present that, from a global perspective, cast light, for example, on the political place that popular groups were building in a changing capitalist economy, as well as the view that the elites, for example, play on that role and that place. I believe that it is important to understand these tensions through a history that is, of course, political, but also economic, and that analyzes the discussions based on moral philosophy and political economy, but also on everyday practices with respect to land, that is what I work, locally defined relations with the state, the understanding that different actors had of economic institutions at a given time, and the ways in which the interaction between economics and politics changes over time. I believe that global urban history requires and is enriched by our increasing interest in thinking about the economy in new ways. And I like, for example, a lot of the work that Alexia Yates, that I think is here, has done on this intersection, and particularly on real estate, housing, and property. And finally, I believe it is key to incorporate in this vision the ideas shown to us by the colonial studies and also by conceptual history. I believe that global urban history requires and forces the historization of concepts. For example, it forces us to understand that the perhaps changing meaning of concepts such as property or urbanization, or to question the probably anachronistic use of concepts such as inequality, while at the same time avoiding their imposition on the past in the way we understand them today. I believe it is crucial to see how concepts circulate, change, and are transformed in these global processes, but above all, how they are understood historically and locally, even if they are used synchronously. In fact, I find Ibero-American conceptual history very useful in that it analyzes how common vocabularies in the Atlantic were interpret, or re-signified according to locally specific political and social circumstances, and how these differences influence local political practices and institutions. That'll be it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Constanza. That's fantastic. Many good ideas here. So our last speaker on this subject of thinking beyond geographic and chronological fields, what's been influencing your thinking on urban inequality. I'm going to turn now to Michael.
And I promise I'll be quick. First, and probably most obviously, reading in public health and the history of disease has tremendously transformed my thinking about how to do history of cities. And again, the past 2 years have proved me right, for better or worse. But also, while I work on French colonial Indochina, I've been reading a lot about representations of urban Chinese in North America, in the Pacific, in Europe, in Limehouse, London, and the ways in which representations of urban Chinese as other intersects with urban disease anxiety. And the thinking about xenophobia in the urban setting has been really important for my thinking about global inequalities and especially sort of lived daily experiences. And I would also note that much of the early 20th century xenophobic rhetoric resonates with centuries-old European anti-Semitism, especially in the context of urban history. Some of the xenophobic sources I look at in colonial Southeast Asia, you could just cut and paste Jew for Chinese, and you would have a document that could come from a European setting. And I find those kinds of geographic comparisons just so fascinating and eye-opening. The question was about temporal and geographic boundaries. I also want to give a disciplinary nod to the cultural anthropologists. And I found that much of my training as an urban historian in traditional social history methods to be useful for mapping out the city, but for getting at the lived experience, things like Clifford Geertz's classic Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, and my sort of clunky, very simple use of thick description to tease out the larger meanings of, some sort of vignette, like, I don't know, killing sewer rats in Hanoi. And then finally, this is a little out of left field, but Susan Sontag's original essay on illness as social metaphor and her follow-up on AIDS as metaphor has been tremendously important for my thinking about otherizing people in cities in the context of disease, and the way in which disease anxiety and disease discourse intersects with race and class and factors into power hierarchies. And I think that was pretty quick, so you're welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone on the panel, for sticking so close to time, for having such great insight into these 3 questions that we've asked you to explore today. And I'm going to use my executive powers as the moderator here, and going to go straight to Q&A. I think there's a great group of people who are here eager to ask questions. I would request that questions be as brief as possible, and the ideal question is one that is addressed to all or many of our panelists, but it's okay, anything goes. Just keep your questions brief, and we'll try to get through these in a rapid fire manner so that we can have the most conversation possible. I am going to need people to use, the problem here is there's only 25 little bubbles on my Zoom screen, and so I can't see everyone simultaneously. I'll just pivot back and forth. I assume that the raise hand function is enabled. Is that correct, Mariana? Anyone?
You've got to unmute yourself.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay, Mike. Okay, so I'm just going to go first up. get in there and get out with a question. Michael Goebel, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for these inspiring and interesting remarks, which I think show such a geographical breadth, which is interesting. I had a particular question, mostly inspired by Hilary Jones's comment about intergenerational change. I struggled to phrase it into a question, right? But I instantly thought of Piketty, of course, as everybody does, where, you know, the whole story about inequality is about the lack of intergenerational change. And so I guess my question would be methodologically, how do we write a larger history of inequality, urban or not, that fold in this dimension of intergenerational change in creative ways?
Should I go ahead and answer, or do you want?
Yeah, go. Yeah, I think let's just go ahead and roll with it. But that's, I think, is a great question. So Hilary, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, and for also asking the methodological question. I will say that you know, one of the things that I think, one of the reasons why I think intergenerational wealth is such an important issue to discuss when it comes to understanding the role of, especially the role of African Americans, of people of African descent, and how they have been impacted by the big global shifts in specifically the modern economy. It's because these questions about who can inherit, how and when are very situational. They're very rooted in the local environments in which they are a part of. So whether you're talking about a New Orleans family, for a Creole New Orleans family, Black Creole family from the 19th century, who is facing the kind of expansion of Northern industrialism into the US South after the Civil War, or you're talking about peoples like the one that I'm talking about in my, or those that I'm talking about in my research, how to hold on to wealth that one might acquire at one moment. And in the case of the families, the elite families of Senegal's coastal towns, it was in part through the slave trade, but it was also through owning property. And as imperialism changed course, one of the things that imperialism did was change the mechanisms of the financial instruments that could be used to hold on to property and to transfer it to the next generation. So for me, one of the key sort of archival tools that was important in my early research, and I continue to go back to, are those of wills and inheritance records. Some of which in African archives are wonderfully maintained and kept, but in other places, Mariana Canjijo has spoken about this for Benguela. She's literally in the process of taking things that have been kept in a, you know, room since the 1800s and ordering them, you know, and making them sort of accessible through digitization projects and preservation projects, because much of this material can be lost to us forever. In San Luis, the town that I studied, a flood, again, one of the sort of early symptoms of sea level rise, essentially sea level rise, but I should also say technological problems with a dam that was built by the government itself. So, you know, man-made and larger environmental forces. But, you know, one of the results of that was the flooding of the mayor's office, where all of these records were kept for the city. So until they were moved, you know, they were moved to a more central location, those sorts of events can sort of wipe out entire records of the transfer of property from one generation to another. And then what happens when, for example, the French government decides to create a bank and liquidates all the assets of people who once held assets in things like boats and houses and slaves, and gives them shares in a bank that really doesn't have much financial power in their local environment. So those are the sorts of questions that I'm interested in, and I think methodologically where one can access some of that information.
Excellent, thank you, Hilary. And this conversation here is calling to mind some of the interesting work that Jean Eberhard and Rebecca Scott did, for instance, tracing across generations in freedom papers. But like you're saying, using this kind of rich and deep kind of source material as opposed to, sparse but generalized sources like census materials and things like that. So I think that's a really good and interesting observation. And then again, I guess we'll all continue to be provoked by this question of like the interplay of intergenerational issues with the kind of cross-sectional or kind of conjuncture factors that we can also identify, and how those kind of cut across one another, I think produces this interesting historical tension. So I'm just scanning really quickly. I don't see any hands up other than Michael. Oh, wait, Michael? Okay, very quickly, Michael. Yeah.
It's just a comment to follow on to that, and maybe to we may not have time, but sort of prod Hillary on this, because I think she'd be the expert for one of the examples I'm thinking of. But that intergenerational wealth and intergenerational forms of privilege and how they intersect with gender in changing urban cultures. So forgive my pronunciation, but I'm thinking of the señores of Goree Island, mixed race women, Luso-African women who had a tremendous amount of privilege. And they have like somewhat of an analog in colonial Java, where Dutchmen were having a very short lifespan because of a whole host of tropical diseases. And there was a class of very successful Javanese merchant women that would marry a series of Dutchmen and inherit their property and go through like 5 or 6 marriages over the course of their life and become quite powerful. And both of those patterns sort of challenge more patriarchal Western capitalist understanding of ownership, property, and also intergenerational wealth and privilege.
That's thank you for adding that. Hillary, do you have a quick addition?
Just quickly, I mean, all of that's in the back of my mind when I was sort of, formulating my response, and you underline how it's not just an African thing, right? That the role of seigneurs in a place like Senegal is very similar to what we see in Java, in places of the fur trading economies in North America. I mean, we can see different kind of corollaries. And one of the reasons why I think this question was also very stimulating some thinking here is that for women at one moment in time, I'm thinking specifically in the 1700s and 1800s, they were able to decide who they wanted what property to go to. And then as sort of new ways of thinking about what property was came around, whether it was through church marriages or through civil registries and the laws of the state, right, which were formulated in sort of more patriarchal terms, they didn't have the same say to decide who stayed in what house, who did they pass their property along to, right? It was in the hands of men. And I think these are one of the places of contestation in a place like Saint Louis, where the economic fortunes of the city declined as new cities came and replaced it. And yet you still have these sorts of afterlives of people and property. And for a long time, there were squatters in houses who stayed there because they said so-and-so and so-and-so said I could stay here because I was part of their family back when, this different social system was in place. And today they're out on the street because they don't have the same claims that they could have made in an earlier generation.
Thank you, Hillary. And these comments make me, they draw attention, I think, to some of what Constanza was talking about in terms of institutions relating to property rights and the way that as those change under colonial or post-colonial regimes, that people's access to property is shifting. And just as you were describing, Hillary, there are people who may have had semi-formal or customary access to property. And I think, not to step on your lines, Constanza, but I feel like you also have some similar stories on your end. But I see a hand up, Nancy Reynolds, please.
Sure, yeah, but I'm happy to let Constanza go if you wanted to respond. I can wait. Are you sure? Because I feel like this is a conversation thread that's helpful. Yeah, thanks. I'm Nancy Reynolds, and I work on cities in the Middle East. And I learned a lot today, so thank you all for these great conversations. And I just, this discussion about intergenerational kind of existence in cities and wealth just made me kind of think back to a lot of my students joke that historians are particularly bad at being able to theorize time. And so I was just wondering about one of the, for me, one of the most innovative and helpful books in thinking about cities in the Middle East is a new book called For the War Yet to Come, Planning Beirut's Frontiers by Hiba Bukhar. And it's a book about kind of the planned deepening of inequality in Beirut, which is a city that has currently in a lot of crisis, obviously, but has a tremendous amount of sectarian. We usually think about sectarianism as kind of a product of the place, but this is to argue that in fact, sectarianism as a developed concept for divide and rule by the French in particular, but also in the post-colonial state really begins to mark the cities in particular ways. And so I just was wondering, I've also been noticing that a huge amount of writing, especially fiction, has come out of Arabic literature recently. It's more kind of sci-fi, science fiction related. I guess I'm also thinking about Dune. So I'm just wondering, like, thinking about the future of these cities, are there ways in which you see kind of planned inequalities, not as just something from the past, but something that is sort of being deepened into the future of these cities in particular ways that might cause us to rethink some of the ways that we imagine global inequality working? Anyway.
Nancy, thank you. That's fantastic. And I love the last part of the question, especially. I feel like, if anyone on the panel wants to dive into the deep end here and think about future inequalities, because
I'll just dive in to give a plug.
Thank you.
For a book that I think is related by that just came out recently by Aaron Jakes, Egypt's Occupation, which elaborates this concept of colonial economism and the sort of racial lens through which the British Empire was examining and planning the reconstitution of the Egyptian economy under the Protectorate. And it's an absolutely phenomenal book for people in all sorts of fields. But I think it also raises a bunch of really important questions about the ways in which colonial economism and forms of colonial economism are still being enacted in the world around us. One could talk about imperial economism as well through, you think about the sort of the Iraq transition team under L. Paul Bremer and the kinds of the legal institutions and rules that were put in place by that transition team about expropriation of foreign profits, foreign direct investment, and I think what you see is apparatuses of economic logic and economistic logic that are echoes still of these kinds of forms from the 19th and early 20th century.
Thanks, David. Others? Michael, I felt that you wanted to say something. I could sense it.
I just wanted to answer Nancy's question. I want to give a plug for Abindo Kusno's books, Kusno. I believe he's a geographer at one of the Canadian universities. I think he's left British Columbia, maybe for Toronto, and he works on Jakarta. And one of the things that is so fascinating in his work is he looks at, just in terms of current practices of sort of planned inequalities, as you said, the architectural style often does throwbacks to Dutch colonial architecture. So you have these McMansions in these Jakarta suburbs with neoclassical Dutch colonial references. And from he's an architect actually, and from that standpoint, it's so fascinating to see colonial motifs rearticulated in a post-colonial setting.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent. I don't know, Hillary and Constanza, do either of you have thoughts on this particular topic? It seems to be It's fascinating. I think what's been brought up so far also just calls to mind what several of you have brought up in our conversation, just the importance of kind of representations or ideas, metaphor, the words that are used to kind of mobilize the urban imaginary around these concepts of the future that seem to often produce the inequalities that we're talking about. So I don't know whether other panelists want to address this question from Nancy right now.
I just want to say something that doesn't have exactly to do with Nancy was asking, but makes me think about what some of the things that I discussed before, and it was the way in which we create our past from our presence and how that has an impact, I think, in the future. But it's a very different take on the future that we were thinking of. But what I was thinking is that, this has to do with not exactly urban history, but like historical thinking. And what I was thinking is that we know that there is an active relationship, the past that has been articulated by philosophers as Gadamer or historians such as Rosen. And what we know is that the past that we create is a necessary prerequisite to motivating and guiding human actions. So I think that this conscious of the historicity of the present affects not only our modes of, I'm sorry for my English, modes of knowing, but also our modes of acting. So what I was thinking when you asked the question was what is the future what we create when we construct our past and the possibilities of I think that is like, I guess I'm thinking about the historical, the political character of historical thinking. So, because that was what I was thinking. So I'm not sure if I'm going, wait.
It's such an important question, Constanza. I feel like that is partially what I was trying to get at in my final comment about trying to reinvigorate an investigation of democratic collective movements that present alternative visions of social relations to those of capitalism, which are quite clearly reproducing all manner of inequality in addition to destroying the planet. So, producing histories that can offer insight, guidance. I mean, history is not, of course, a production of a menu of options, and we need to be careful to avoid doing that. But I also think that this brings me back to a thought that I had in your response to the second question when you were discussing developmental theory and its kind of instrumentalization of 19th century history and looking at the 20th. And I was wondering whether or not some instrumentalization of history is not actually that bad. And the problem with development theory was less its instrumentalization of the past and more its racism. That's a question that I think others can debate more fruitfully than I can.
Yeah.
All right. Excellent points all across the board here. And I do have my own questions that I would be happy to add to the mix here, but I also see that it's 1:29. So running out the clock, I don't see other hands raised.
One in the
chat. Question in
There's
the
one
chat.
in the chat.
Well, if you expect me to be multitasking here and looking at the chat as well. So from the chat, I can't turn on my mic. Okay, so here's the question. This is from Tamer. I'm wondering if we shift our attention to the global dimensions of decolonization in the post-war period, then our discussion of inequality will probably have to factor in an international scale, especially in relation to third worldist contestations of the colonial legacies of economic dependency. This is great because this goes right to what we were just talking about. Calls for a new international economic order and how they materialize in cities, especially in relation to how perceptions of international inequality play themselves out in practices of comparison between cities in the global north and south. I think that's fantastic. And so we're going to close out with quick answers. This is a big question. There's a lot there, but really we're talking about global dimensions of decolonization, contestations of colonial legacies relating to economic dependency, and this kind of specters of comparison that haunt these discussions about cities in the global north and south. So I'm going to just ask our panelists to kind of quickly, if you have something that you want to say here, say it now. We're going to run very slightly over time, but let's
Constanza
roll.
may have something.
So
Constanza may have something to add here,
no?
but my only comment here is read Amy Offner.
Okay, read Amy Offner. That's
Oh,
that's
I totally agree with that.
okay,
Amy
that's
Offner.
been seconded. So it's the motion is has been seconded. We're all in agreement. Yes, okay. Amy Offner. Hillary, Michael, anything to say on that? I mean, it's so much there to talk about. I feel like we can't really do justice, you know, going over time, but it's such a great set of questions. And I think that, please go ahead.
Just culturally, I think that there's that we can look at the phenomenon of the hyper elites that are these sort of hyper rich nomads that are comfortable in Jakarta, in Shanghai, in New York, and San Francisco, and live in a world that is so isolated from the rest of the urban settings that they bounce from, like frogs jumping from lily pads, if you want more metaphors.
Nice.
Constanza's that term political character of historical thinking is really useful in answer to Tamer's observation, and also connected to me to Nancy's question. And so, you know, I would just add in here that in thinking about those connections through a place like Senegal, and thinking about, you know, what the sort of futures of how these inequalities are understood or dealt with in a post-colonial world is, you know, places like Dakar are now taking much of their inspiration, whether it's through architecture, through the transfer of commodities, through forming new markets. They're looking more to the Maghreb, to North Africa, to Egypt, to the Arab world, to Saudi Arabia, and to that region as a point of reference, because it is in opposition to the French colonial past and even the more recent US post-colonial Cold War period past. So I do think that, you know, you hit on some important observations there, that when we're thinking about where the futures of these cities lie and the ways in which people, especially in developing countries, reimagine and imagine the city constantly, there are other frames of reference that are factoring in that we may not even be thinking about, because our frame, you know, is limited or takes us to the West or to different sort of points of reference.
All right, thank you, Hillary. That's excellent. All right, Mariana, I take it that we're supposed to be concluding at this juncture. Is that correct?
I think unfortunately we have to, so I'm sure
we must conclude. I feel
the
like this
people in
conversation,
Berlin, it's very late for them. We have to keep them in mind.
That's fair. Yes, that's fair enough. But I feel like the conversation has only just begun. And I hope that everyone here in attendance, that we have opportunities in the future to continue to talk about these important issues, and that we'll all be in touch down the road. I want to thank the panelists for their excellent participation in today's event. I want to thank Mariana and her team for putting this together. And thanks to the audience for being here and hearing these important ideas. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mariana.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I will just say in the email that you received about the meeting, there's links to the GUP Dream Conversations page. We will be posting as we organize new conversation